There are moments in life that are never planned, never rehearsed, and yet leave the deepest mark. For Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo, one such moment happened not under the blinding lights of fame, but in the most unexpected silence of complete darkness. The story begins in a television studio in Beijing. The two had been called in for a late-night recording session, nothing unusual for stars of their magnitude. The studio was buzzing with crew members, cameras positioned, microphones checked, and makeup artists making their final touches. Xiao Zhan wore his signature calm smile, while Wang Yibo sat quietly on the edge of the stage, stretching his fingers absent-mindedly, his mind elsewhere. But then, just when everyone thought the night would proceed smoothly, it happened, the lights went out. At first, it was just a flicker, a small glitch no one paid attention to. But within seconds, the entire studio was plunged into pitch-black darkness. The giant screens went blank, the cameras shut down, and a stunned silence fell over the room. Gasps echoed through the set as the crew scrambled, some fumbling with their phones to turn on flashlights. For Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo, however, the darkness became something else entirely. In that sudden stillness, it felt as though the world had disappeared, leaving only the two of them breathing in the void. Wang Yibo instinctively turned his head toward where he knew Xiao Zhan was standing, and in the absence of cameras and curious eyes, there was no need for masks. Yibo, Xiao Zhan's voice cut through the darkness, low, calm, but carrying an intensity that caught Wang Yibo off guard. For a moment, the younger actor didn't reply. His throat tightened, and he wondered if he had only imagined it. But then he heard footsteps, a careful, deliberate movement closer. "You don't have to answer right away," Xiao Zhan continued, his words softer now, almost hesitant. "But since there's no one watching, no one listening, let me say this." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of emergency power somewhere in the distance. Wang Yibo felt his chest tighten, every nerve awake, every instinct telling him to listen. "I know you think I don't notice," Xiao Zhan whispered, "but I do. Every time you change the choreography to slip in a move only I would recognize, every time your eyes find me in a crowded room. I've always noticed." Wang Yibo's heart raced. He remembered the very things Xiao Zhan was speaking of, the subtle messages hidden in his dance routines, the sideways glances when the cameras weren't supposed to catch it. He had convinced himself it was his own secret, something Xiao Zhan would never see. And yet, here in the dark, stripped of all pretenses, it was laid bare. "You don't need to hide in movements," Xiao Zhan said quietly. "Not with me." Wang Yibo exhaled sharply, the sound betraying how much he had been holding in. "And what if I don't know how else to say it?" His voice cracked slightly, unguarded in a way it had never been in public. There was a pause, long enough that it felt like the entire world had stopped. And then Xiao Zhan spoke again, his words heavy with meaning. "Then let me show you how." In the complete darkness, Wang Yibo felt a hand brush against his own. It wasn't a grab, not even a full touch, just the faintest brush of fingertips, a silent permission, an unspoken truth. His instinct was to pull back, but instead, he let his fingers linger. It was a gesture that screamed louder than words ever could. The studio remained in blackout for nearly 20 minutes. Crew members whispered nervously, someone joked about a power surge, and others tried to calm themselves. But for Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo, those minutes were timeless. They spoke in fragments, unfinished sentences, confessions that hung in the air, questions that neither had dared to ask before. "Do you ever think about how different it could have been if we met before all of this?" Wang Yibo asked quietly. "All the time," Xiao Zhan admitted. "But then I realize, maybe the chaos, the lights, the fame, it had to happen this way. Otherwise, we'd never have known what it meant to fight for something real." The younger man swallowed hard, his voice almost trembling when he asked, "And what are we fighting for?" Xiao Zhan didn't hesitate. "Us." The word hung in the dark like a flare, small yet impossible to ignore. Just as the emergency lights began to flicker back on, the spell between them lingered. Their hands had already parted before anyone could see, but their eyes locked in the dim glow. For the briefest moment, it was as if they were the only two people in the world, their secret stitched into the darkness that no one else had witnessed. When the studio fully lit again, the crew resumed their frantic activity, acting as if nothing had happened. But Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo knew the truth. Something had shifted. Something that could never be unseen, never be undone. Later that night, long after the recording had finished and the world assumed they had gone their separate ways, Wang Yibo found himself replaying Xiao Zhan's words over and over. "You don't need to hide in movements. Not with me." It was terrifying and liberating all at once. For years, he had spoken in codes, in choreography, in silence. And now, someone had read between the lines, understood him completely. Meanwhile, Xiao Zhan sat alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection. He had spoken what he had carried for so long, unsure if it had been the right moment, unsure if it had even been wise. But in that blackout, in that fleeting bubble of honesty, he had chosen to give Wang Yibo the one thing he had always held back: truth. The media would never know about that night. The headlines would only talk about the recording delay, the technical malfunction, the inconvenience of lost time. But for the two of them, the darkness had given them something priceless: clarity. And perhaps, that was why fate had chosen that exact moment to cut the lights. Because sometimes, you need the world to go dark to finally see each other clearly. What Xiao Zhan said in that silence, what Wang Yibo confessed in fragments, these are the things no scriptwriter could have imagined, no fan could have predicted. It was raw, real, and utterly unforgettable. They would carry that night with them in every performance afterward. The secret glances became heavier, the hidden touches more deliberate, and the distance between them, though necessary in public, was no longer empty. It was filled with everything they had dared to say in the dark. Perhaps the world will never know the full story of that blackout. Perhaps only they will remember the electricity in the silence, the weight of words spoken without fear of cameras. But for Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo, the truth is simple: when the studio lights went out, something far brighter sparked between them. And in that brief moment of darkness, they discovered what it really meant to be seen. The blackout felt endless. The kind of silence that stretched time, pulling every second like a thread that refused to snap. No camera, no spotlight, no audience, just Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo in a studio suddenly swallowed by pitch-black stillness. At first, their instincts were professional. Wang Yibo shifted in his seat, waiting for the crew to sort it out. Xiao Zhan tilted his head toward the faint noise of someone fumbling for a flashlight. But then, against the backdrop of nervous whispers, something unexplainable passed between them. It was as though the universe had flipped a switch, dimming the world so only their truth could surface. And that's when Xiao Zhan spoke. "Yibo," he said, his voice steady but low. The name carried differently in the dark. Softer, more intimate, like it wasn't meant for public ears. Wang Yibo froze, his pulse quickening. He had heard Xiao Zhan say his name thousands of times, on set, during rehearsals, in casual conversations, but this was different. This was charged, weighted, and impossible to ignore. Xiao Zhan moved closer, guided only by instinct, by the memory of where Yibo had been standing just before the lights cut. His footsteps were measured, almost hesitant. Then, with a calmness that felt rehearsed yet wasn't, he continued. "You don't need to keep hiding in movements." His tone dropped into a near whisper, but in the silence of the blackout, it was deafening. "Not with me." The words sliced through Wang Yibo's carefully built walls. For so long, he had turned his feelings into choreography, slipping coded gestures into his routines, burying unspoken truths in dance. A tilt of the head. A hand brushing across his chest. A glance timed too perfectly. They were pieces of him he thought no one else could decode. But Xiao Zhan had noticed. He had always noticed. Wang Yibo's fingers curled into fists, not in anger, but to steady the tremor of his hands. He wanted to reply, but his throat was dry, his voice trapped somewhere between confession and fear. "What if I don't know how else to say it?" he finally managed, his voice low, fragile. Xiao Zhan was silent for a long moment, so long that Wang Yibo thought maybe the darkness had swallowed his words. But then, softly, Xiao Zhan answered. "Then let me show you." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was simple. And that simplicity made it all the more earth-shattering. A brush of fingers followed, delicate, tentative. Xiao Zhan's hand ghosted against Wang Yibo's, not holding, not pressing, just there. Permission, not demand. Wang Yibo's breath caught. His instinct screamed to retreat, but instead, he let his fingertips linger. That small, fleeting connection became louder than any declaration they could have shouted to the world. Around them, the crew scrambled to restore power. A director barked orders, a technician cursed under his breath, and someone laughed nervously to cover the tension. But inside that pocket of darkness, the two of them carved out a space that belonged only to them. Their voices dipped into fragments, unfinished sentences that carried more weight than polished speeches. "Do you remember?" Wang Yibo began, then stopped. "Which time?" Xiao Zhan prodded gently. "The first time we met after everything changed." Xiao Zhan smiled faintly, though Yibo couldn't see it. "I remember you wouldn't look at me for longer than 3 seconds. You made it impossible," Yibo muttered, his voice tinged with something between frustration and vulnerability. "You always make it impossible." There was no teasing in Xiao Zhan's tone when he replied. "That's because you always make it unforgettable." For a long while, neither of them spoke. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, but instead of suffocating, it gave them a strange kind of freedom. They didn't have to meet each other's eyes. They didn't have to perform for cameras. They didn't have to hide. It was Wang Yibo who broke the silence again, his words spilling out before he could stop them. "I used to wonder if you ever saw me, like, really saw me. Not the actor, not the image, but me." Xiao Zhan's answer came without hesitation. "Always." That one word landed heavier than 1,000 confessions. It wrapped around Yibo like a lifeline, steadying the storm inside him. The faint glow of emergency lights flickered on then, dim but enough to outline their silhouettes. Their hands were already apart, their faces composed, but their eyes betrayed everything. The moment didn't end with the lights. If anything, it deepened. Now, with just enough light to see each other's faces, the truth lingered like an unspoken vow. Xiao Zhan's expression was unreadable to the outside world, but Wang Yibo saw the softness there, the unguarded sincerity reserved only for him. The crew cheered as the full studio lights roared back to life. Everyone pretended relief, joking about power surges and faulty circuits. The chaos reset the room, but Xiao Zhan and Wang Yibo knew they weren't returning to the same reality they had lived in before the blackout. Something irreversible had happened. They walked back to their places, resumed their roles, and smiled for the cameras when the recording continued. But underneath the surface, both of them carried the same thought. In that darkness, they had touched a truth they couldn't deny. Later, alone in his dressing room, Wang Yibo pressed his hand to his chest, replaying Xiao Zhan's words like a hidden song. "You don't need to keep hiding in movements. Not with me." He closed his eyes and let the weight of it sink in. And somewhere down the hall, Xiao Zhan stared at his reflection in the mirror, hearing his own voice echo in his mind. "Then let me show you." The world would never know what really happened when the studio lights went out. The headlines would mention a power outage, nothing more. But to them, that blackout was no accident. It was the universe stripping away everything unnecessary until only truth remained. In the silence of the dark, they had spoken more than they ever had under the glare of the spotlight. And long after the lights came back, the glow of that moment refused to fade. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more dramatic and mind-blowing stories about your favorite stars.